Thank you for coming. Friendship. When we talk about friendship, or the ideal friend, we think of immediately of certain characteristics. Honesty comes to mind, truthfulness, and if they're really a gutsy kind of a friend, they would just tell you like it is, what's happening with you, without holding anything back, because they come from a point of love, of caring, of understanding, of appreciating, without any malintent. So in a way they reflect who you are, who we are. It's like having the perfect mirror in one's life. When we need them to be around, I guess a very good adjective there would be reliability. You can rely on a good friend, an honest one, a truthful one. Come rain or shine, they're there. Well, today's talk is not necessarily about friends or friendships, but it is about a quality that today's topic has with these qualifiers for what a friendship is. So today's talk is about old age, sickness, and death. And like all of us, I've been struggling with these. They also happen to be part of the latter portions of the dependent origination teaching that the Buddha gave us. Old age, sickness, and death. And for years, every time I came around, in my mind, I just came around to just say it in my head. You start with ignorance and all that, craving, clinging, bhava, becoming and all that. And then birth, old age, sickness, and death. You kind of tone it down at the end. You just don't want to hear it. You just let it phase out. But living in a culture where we are in many ways manicuring our lives, where we're trimming, we are cutting out those things about life that seem rather unpleasant, not meshing well with what we hold to be dear, what we hold to be appreciated. Old age, sickness, and death all of a sudden become even more relevant. I mention social media oftentimes because or just media in general, movies, just the themes that are constantly being echoed in our society and in our minds. There's this underlining, recurring theme of wanting to maintain, to sustain the state of youthfulness, which is, I could say, I could repeat what we're thinking about it, it's just absurd. But it's so amazing how we can convince ourselves that we are going to sustain ourselves, not having gray hair, not having the wrinkles, not getting old, definitely not getting Alzheimer's, definitely not having to rely on a walker, definitely being able to go up a flight of stairs, etc., etc. But if we look around, the people around us, or just other human beings who have lived on this planet for a little bit longer than ourselves, we see that's not the case. There's so many cultural nuances attached to this, you know. In some cultures, having gray hair is not it's not a nice thing. So I had, years ago, a martial arts instructor who was amazing, by the way. He died in his 90s. But for the latter part of his life, like about 20 years or so, he was dyeing his hair. Everybody knew it. No one actually wanted to mention it to him. And it was blatant. I mean, it was really one of those loud, you know, ones. And he would talk about youthfulness. So if you removed the theme of youthfulness from his life, all of a sudden it's like what he stood for as a martial arts instructor, as if it was undermined. And I would think about that. And I was much younger then, you know, about 20 years younger. And I was just like, but what's wrong with having gray hair? What's wrong with having the wrinkles? I mean, isn't that a slap in the face of reality of life? In that sense, when you look at old age, which, by the way, is a controversial topic in today's society, people don't want to hear the word old unless it's an old artifact. You know, you go to the Getty Museum, if the older it is, hey, the better it is, the more valuable it is. For certain things, we have some room to accept. But when it comes to us, oh no. No, no. The moment we have a headache, we look for that bottle of Tylenol or Excedrin or something. I used to be a fan of Excedrin years ago. And then I saw what it did to my liver. So anyway, I'm not putting down Excedrin. You know, there's some, you know, wonderful things that it's doing, I guess, to some people. So I'm not plugging for anything. But maybe the headache is actually trying to teach us something. A headache is another version of old age, sickness. Basically, it's throwing that wrench into the machine. It's making us feel uncomfortable, uneasy. It's like that, you know, oyster that all of a sudden has this tiny little grain of sand that snuck into its shell, and it's bothering it. Well, guess what the oyster does? It might spend decades working on it, but it will finally be able to accomplish a wonderful looking, lovely South Sea pearl, or a pearl coming out of it. From that grain of sand, because it was uncomfortable, it starts putting on its own saliva, its own juices to cover it up. Layer by layer by layer by layer by layer. All of a sudden, we humans come in and say, aha, here's a precious item. Well, we have so many opportunities in life where we can actually turn the headache, the old age, the sickness, and even death into a wonderful teaching lesson, a mechanism. Instead of looking down on it as, I've been hit by that arrow as well. The arrow of old age. The bags under the eyes. I mean, you name it, there's so many. And in the beginning I mentioned about the qualities of a friend, and one of them was reliability. Sickness is a reliability. Having a disease, having a headache is there as a fact, as a reflection, as something that is going to show up. And the Tylenol is going to end up being the thing that is going to cover it up, try to camouflage it, to try to make it go away. It's just like that friend who tells you like it is. And you want to close their mouth and say, okay, stop. But because of your love for them, you're just like, he or she has some truth in what they're saying, and I've always trusted their judgment, so let me hear it, even though it's uncomfortable. So, looking at it from that angle, perhaps we can actually carve out some heartwarming space for old age, sickness, and death in our lives, instead of shunning it from our society. I mean, they've become things that we don't want to talk about, things that we don't want to acknowledge. We've even started to censor our own use of our language by trimming out certain words. If I am looking at someone and they're over a certain age, well, I have to watch out because I don't want to hurt their feelings. Because that's what society today, with all this political incorrectness, or correctedness, politically incorrect, I guess. See, it's words, syntax, it's absolute nonsense when it comes to reality. The wrinkle does not care whether it is politically correct or incorrect. It's the society that's telling us, dictating as to what we need to say. Meanwhile, the fact is there. The hair is falling out. The memory is slowly drifting away. The knees aren't functioning as well. And yes, people are dying. Every culture has come up with ways of kind of, I wouldn't say justifying, but at least trimming out the edges, photoshopping certain things out. And this is not just new, it's been going on for eons, millennia. We hear this often, like if you hear someone passed away, immediately people start getting apologetic about it, or at least come up constructing these wonderful ideals. He's in a better place now. Or she's better off, right now, she's in heaven. She's this, or he's this, and okay, I mean, I'm not even going to get into like what guarantees do you have, but what's wrong with death? Legal entities bend over backwards over this. I know in therapeutic circles, we have to really use tweezers when it comes to issues like this. There's so many laws that we have to abide by when it comes to subject of death, or wanting to commit suicide and things like that for terminally ill patients, for example. And there's 6 or 7 states that in this country that allow doctors to help that process. If a person is coherent and all that, but they know the doctors have diagnosed them that they're not going to be around for another 6 months or so, and so it's going to be a very bad, downhill for them to survive even those months. So anyhow, those are some technicalities, but the issue is, how do we look at old age? How do we look at death? How do we look at illness and sickness? And so the taboos of today's society. Fortunately, there are some cultures where still old age and sickness is in some ways, I wouldn't say revered, but at least respected for what they are. And driving here today, I was thinking, about this, and I was all of a sudden reminded of King Suddhodana, Siddhartha's own father, before he became the Buddha. This man, for over 29 years or so, he made sure that Siddhartha was not going to be exposed to old age, sickness, and death. He tried his best. always bringing in new folks, new staff, new people, younger looking, beautiful looking, to cater to his needs. He would dye his hair, the king himself and the queen and everybody that, there was no way of getting rid of them from the palace. Everybody was in top shape, and if they were sick for whatever reason, they would just get a sick leave and not show up until they're completely recovered and then show up. Why? Because those factors might instigate the prince to pause and ask some critical questions about life. And if he did, the early astrologers had told him when the Siddhartha was just born that, hey, your son might either be a universal monarch, a king, ruling the world, or its redeemer, a Buddha. Obviously, being a king, you're going to vote for the first one. So he tried his best to make sure that the Buddha part scenario would never play out. And I look at our society today, and I think each of us, in some way, have become King Suddhodana. We're trying to block out, even in our minds, refusing acceptability for these phenomena that are part and parcel of who we are. If we are an organism, if we are a living, breathing entity, organic entity, we go from a process of coming together, let's call it birth, and then we dissolve. In biology, we know that every cell has its own time bomb, in a sense. It has its own lifespan. The nucleolus where the DNA is replicated, that's how we have mitosis, cells duplicating themselves, That's how if you cut yourself and you heal, that's what's happening. Cells are duplicating themselves. Well, that's happening because of the internal copy machine, the Xerox machine, which is in the nucleolus. And that's how the DNA, RNA duplicate themselves. Okay, but that has a limit. Now, when cells, however, forget to die, which is their natural cycle, part of their cycle, when they start forgetting that, we call those cells cancerous cells. Why? Because they've forgotten to die. So it just keeps on duplicating itself, even though it is completely malfunctioned. It's totally useless to the body, and that's how we end up having tumors. I mean, simplistically explaining it. So even cells know that they're supposed to die. Now, how often do we actually give it its due respect? I mean, you pick one of those three. And in Pali, in the Dhamma, they're called the three messengers, by the way. Old age, sickness, and death. And they don't necessarily have to follow that order, but death has to be there, obviously. And I was thinking about the word messenger. They're called Devadutas, and they're messengers. I started the talk with the word friendship, honesty, loyalty, reliability. Somebody who can say to you what you need to hear. And messengers, we have a saying, a phrase in English like, don't shoot the messenger, right? Well, similarly, the messenger is delivering a message. And it's a perfect example of a mirror. It's telling us where we are at the moment. There's nothing to be afraid of. There's nothing. It's just a process. And perhaps it's in childhood, the stories we get to hear, what people tell us. We're highly impressionable when we're children. Once we hear something, it just makes its grooves in the brain. It has its own neural pathways now, and it starts constructing these palaces in the brain of of possibilities, which unfortunately we don't stop and think and consider as to their viability or possibility. We just take them for granted. And old age, sickness, and death comes to, all of them come in to pull the rug from under those concepts, presumptions, assumptions. And years ago I started I wouldn't call it a habit, but I would not close the door for that possibility in my life. So if a friend of mine or somebody I knew even remotely tells me that so-and-so passed away, I would make it a point that I would, I would go to the funeral just to see the person. And we always, I had that done, our family had that done with my dad and my mother. So the wake and all that with the picture, they put a nice picture of the person, and then the undertakers or for Islam, whatever, they start doing their magic, makeup, this and that, as if like in the old days, in the time of the Buddha, even actually right now, if you go to parts of Nepal or India, definitely, there are cremation grounds, and you see things the way they are, not photoshopped. And it's in front of your face, it's right there. And you see the human body, how it's going through all these, whether it's being cremated, etc. And I had a chance to go with Venerable Sadada. We went to this famous, I think it's the 7th most sacred spot for Hindus in the world, and it happens to be in Nepal, in Kathmandu. And we went through the back door, and only men are allowed to go in and see it. So there's a river that's flowing, and right next to the river on the bank, and it's elevated from the river, are these areas where they just are protruding. It's like a concrete, but on top of it is where they bring in these stretchers with the bodies. And they cover it up with wood, this and then. There are special individuals who are designated with the work of doing all the ceremony, burning and all that. And I looked over and I saw in the river, close to the area where after the body is cremated, they toss the remains into the water. Now sometimes, if not all, most of the times, many people are not able to actually, can't afford to have tons and tons of wood to keep burning, because the body has to be burned for a certain amount of time. By the way, I realize that for some listeners this might not feel okay, but hey, the topic allows me to. I realize we're in Los Angeles, out of all places, plastic surgery capital of the world. And I asked, okay, I saw these nets in the water that were sticking their heads out, like these spokes, but I could see that there are some nets attached in between these poles in the water. And the Venerable said, he confirmed what I was thinking. Basically, he said that some of the bones don't get to be completely dissolved in the fire, or destroyed, or some of the pieces, in fact. And what happens is those get caught in the netting. And I didn't ask after what happens, but and it's there. They see it. What I'm after is just to give, when we see the sun spreading its rays, it's spreading it all over the place. Even the shade is getting a bit of the rays of sunlight. And as Dharma teachers, I think we have some type of a responsibility, but at the same time an allowance of carte blanche to speak about these things and to talk about it, because many people have convinced all of us, I mean, to some degree, at one point or another, have convinced ourselves that these are not to be talked about. When every one of us is going through it, I mean, it's ridiculous not to do that, to talk about it. So, I'm not glorifying these aspects of life, because they are aspects of life. What it is, it has to be turned into opportunities. So, old age, sickness, and death are also like the friends, yes, but friends are also anchors in our lives. So old age, sickness, and death are anchors in our lives in the sense that they can remind us as to how fleeting life is. I was sitting with good friends of mine not too long ago, and I looked around and I just felt, oh my, it's so rare. This moment is so rare. The universe has worked its way, you know. Buddhism has many explanations of that. Yes, the conditions and consequences of all these have come together at this moment in time where through many years you've developed these connections, and there you are sitting there having a lovely dinner. And it's like, wow, this is so rare. Who knows when, if we'll ever be able to do that. I felt the same thing the other, last weekend, last Sunday. I'm sitting there with my family, with my brothers and my sister. I was like, wow, this is it. It will end one day, it's just a matter of time, but how precious is this? So that inevitably anchors me in the moment of appreciating life and appreciating the precious birth, the human birth that allows me to become aware of my decisions that I make in life, between choosing wholesome versus unwholesome. Yes, we do choose, and that's how we develop karma. We're choosing all the time. I'm not of that camp who thinks that, no, we're not choosing anything, it's society. No, that takes off the burden and responsibility from our shoulders. I don't buy into that. We're constantly choosing. The moment that we are delusional, the moment that we are ignorant, moha is one of the three defilements. Ignorance. The unwillingness to question things, the whys. Why? Why am I doing this way? Why? Having the audacity to ask why, and in an honest fashion, allows us to be anchored in the moment. And life is in many ways anchoring us in the truthfulness of facts. The fact that I'm gonna die. And there's nothing wrong with that. Okay, so let me bring in some sense of urgency into my life, not to take things for granted, and really appreciating my friends and saying it like it is, with compassion to myself, and living life with responsibility. Every time I see the Buddha statue, I always see that. Living life with responsibility. I remember many years ago I read that the greatest act one can commit, according to the Dhamma, that's karmically wholesome, is to sit and meditate. I was like, how is that possible? I wasn't that much of a meditator then, so I didn't know what that meant until I actually experienced it. So not taking things for granted. And those three messengers, old age, sickness, and death, are simply reminders for us. Hey, come on, get back on the horse. Come on. No matter how many times you fall, no matter how many times you become oblivious or ignorant of the fact that life is fleeting, and really become mindful and practice the Eightfold Path. Old age, sickness, and death are just like knocking on our doors, constantly reminding us. So in that sense, they are really probably even closer to us than our real life friends. In that sense. So they're to be celebrated, they're to be embraced, loved, taken good care of, just like you would take care of a good friendship. Appreciating them. And not fearing any of these. Allowing them the space that they deserve in your life. So that is the talk. Thank you for listening, but we have time to a few questions.
Question, comment?
Please. Yes, Russell.
This is a really philosophical and a difficult talk.
Yes.
At least for me. Because I recently dyed my hair.
Oh.
It was a business. Well, it was a business thing. I needed to sell. I was going somewhere. I needed to sell stuff. Books and things, and I did not want to appear, like a has right? So I basically did it, and it actually helped.
Hey.
Stuff.
Absolutely.
So, what I'm saying is that your talk is very, I think, pretty profound, but on the market.
Yes.
And whether it's selling products,
Mm-hmm.
getting a spouse or girlfriend or boyfriend or whatever, I mean, you have to do these things, right?
You're 100% correct. I will not disagree with you because we are, after all, living in a culture that unfortunately is highly based on superficialities in some cases.
Selves.
Yes. Because it's the, that adage of like it's first impressions mean everything, right? If you're meeting someone, whether for a job interview, whether for a date, whether trying to impress someone, your in-laws or whatever, the first impression is huge. No one disputes that. And then once they give you a time of day, once they allow you that extra few moments, and they start seeing that you're far more than that. But unfortunately, we are living in a culture like, you hear it all the time. Certain employees got fired because they did not match the look of the profession. Right? Flight attendants happen to be, at the front line of some of these, or, there's so many examples in this, right? But my question in that, having said all that, my question there for you or anyone in that position would be, how much of that had, if it had anyhow, any clinging on your part to it, and identification with it as this is part of me, Russell. This is me now. I feel rejuvenated. I feel this and that. And that's where I would put that extra, within parentheses, the question, why? Why? Constantly. And what is the mind's investment in this? I totally agree that to make a living, we have to sometimes put, who cares about a nice suit, right? But when you're putting it on, it's presentable. You're presenting it to someone. So it's like a means to an end. So is there any craving, any clinging? That would be the litmus test.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah. Yes.
I think what you're talking about is an American modern phenomenon that I remember, like my grandmother. She was old. She loved being old. She saved her entire life for her last great sickness. And her greatest regret is she didn't have it. She just died. But I think in modern American culture, we're obsessed with this. But other cultures, like Europe, they honor the aging person. I just think of like Catherine Deneuve.
Mm.
She has aged beautifully, but she is older.
Mm-hmm.
And when I get my Vanity Fair magazine, it's usually a woman that I can't recognize because they have photoshopped out any characteristic that she has earned by the way she's lived. I mean, she's creamy white skin usually, or black, but I mean...
No liver spots.
No liver spots, no indication that she has actually lived. But I think it's the sickness of our culture.
True. Yes.
So
Yeah.
Move to Italy.
Yes. Well, I mean, well said. Well said. Yes.
Seems like at the end of the day, the problem, it always comes back to like clinging, aversion, and that kind of stuff. Because I'm assuming it's okay, right, if I moisturize to avoid getting wrinkles, right? Like I'm assuming it's not bad to moisturize, or it's not bad to say try to, like if I put that suit, like I like wearing suits actually. Like
Yes.
If I wear a suit, I'm like, I feel great.
Yes.
Good, my shoes are wonderful, my hair is coiffed, blah blah blah, right? Like I'm assuming like that's all fine and dandy, right? The problem would be if, even though I moisturize, I get wrinkles and I freak out.
Mm-hmm.
Then they would say that's the problem. Taking care of your skin, okay.
Yeah.
Flipping out because you're getting older, flipping out because of the
Yes.
white hairs, and that's a problem. But it's not necessarily don't take care of yourself, or to put it simply, like don't try to. It's okay to make your youthfulness, stretch it out as much as you can, if you will, right? Enjoy, squeeze it to this last drop, right? Your flexibility, nimbleness, whatever it is, but it's how you respond to when it's gone.
Could you kill it, please?
Test, I guess, right? Like
Mm-hmm.
how you respond to, like, my back now hurts, or my knees
Yes.
hurt, and it doesn't matter how many creams I put on my face. It's just wrinkled now. But if I'm okay with that, like I'm not attached, I just kind of let it go. Oh,
Yes.
no, there's wrinkled, then I'm all right. I'm
Yeah.
a good Buddhist.
Well,
Following the path in the right sort of way, I guess,
yes.
if I'm not.
Well, the Buddha believed in medicine, so
Yeah.
so
One-
it's not like it was like, oh, okay,
Yeah.
I got to this. One of the things he believed in was medicine.
Well-
Medicine needed medicine.
Absolutely. The 4 requisites that a monk needs to have.
Right.
One of them is medicine.
So
And many of the laity that used to come to listen to the Buddha speak, and eventually many of them have become enlightened, whether it's stream enterers, once returners, non-returners, and even arahants, were very well established royalty, basically the top echelon of society of that time. Many of whom were princes and kings who had spent hours coiffing their hair, getting moisturized and all that by their servants, and then go to listen to the Buddha speak. And many of them were enlightened. So now, how much of an attachment was there? That is the question. Yes, that is the question to ask ourselves. How much of it is still lingering on? Am I is again the tranquility of my mind perturbed because, I didn't moisturize, I didn't apply another layer of something on me, or I spotted that gray hair. Instead, an adequate response would be, oh, interesting, there it is, there's an impermanence. Impermanence. So that becomes a tool for awakening itself. Because the body, and I've mentioned this before, the Buddha has said, everything there is to know, the whole entire Dhamma is encapsulated within this fathom-long body. In that sense, it is the perfect anchor. It reminds us the whole Dhamma is here, in your own body, if we can remember that. So, if there are any questions, because time's running out, let's, if you could leave it for right after the ceremony is over. So, thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Chandana. So after that, you can ask many questions. So we chant page 4 and page 10.